Oh, the promise and the oath you swore have been painted red over my door.
Welcome to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Listeners, welcome back to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. I'm Josh Hawkins, and as always, I'm here with Bill Schofield and John Harrigan. Hey guys, how are you?
Hey man, doing well.
Doing good.
Great to be with you guys as always. Anything new?
See, kids are just starting back into school, which is cool. Routine's great. Their sleep rhythm has not yet gone back to school time. So that is a little bit of a train wreck every morning. That kind of lasts throughout the day until they go to bed, again too late. And then we start and do the same thing again the next day. So we're working on that.
Nice.
Yeah, I don't even ask how late my boys stay up.
Yeah.
Sometime long after we go to bed.
At least your oldest has a job now, right?
Yeah. After our crash landing back into the States for the fall, we've managed to pull life together and put a new transmission in the van, and our oldest son starts college next week, and he has a job, so life's looking up.
That's awesome. Come on. Nice. Well, always great to be with you guys. Listeners, great to have you again for another episode of our show. As you know, on this fourth season of our show, we've been talking about the parables of Jesus. We've been putting them in their historical context and highlighting the commonly held apocalyptic narrative and the framework that they've held of their day. Last week, we spent some time in a Q&A, and the week before, we spent some time talking about parables of the lost things. Lost sheep, lost coin, lost son, etc. And we talked about how Jesus was accusing the religious leadership of distancing themselves from the sinners in Israel instead of ultimately shepherding them toward God and toward obedience toward the covenant. And Jesus, we saw, employed language and ideas that would have really reinforced Jewish apocalyptic eschatology rather than redefine it in some way. And so today we want to continue our look at the parables, and we want to look at Luke 16 and the parable of the dishonest manager. If there's any question about Jewish apocalypticism, this is a very apocalyptic parable. And so before we kind of get into that apocalyptic context, let me read the parable. I'm going to read Luke 16, verses 1 through 13. I'm going to read from the NASB. And it says, Jesus was saying to his disciples, verse 1, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager. The manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig. I am ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. And he summoned each one of his master's debtors, and he began saying to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and write 80. And his master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust the true riches to you? And if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Well, guys, let's dive in to the apocalyptic context of this parable like we always do. What can we say about the language of this parable, and how does it emphasize first century Jewish apocalyptic thought?
Yeah, I mean, 16 is kind of the continuation of 15, which is the continuation of the exhortation in 14. And so 15 and 16 are all parables that are designed to amplify what's being said in chapter 14, which when we talked about chapter 14, it's super apocalyptic, talking about the resurrection of the just, the coming kingdom of God, the messianic banquet, and the necessity of renouncing everything in this age to inherit those things, to be the Messiah's disciples. So the parables in 15 and 16 are designed to reinforce that apocalyptic exhortation in chapter 14. And there's a lot of cues in 16, whereas chapter 15 didn't have that many internal cues, apocalyptic cues. Chapter 16 does have those apocalyptic cues, particularly in verse 8, where you have the sons of this age being more shrewd or wise or astute than the sons of light. And so sons of, the two-age reference is an apocalyptic cue. The sons of light, which is, language that's used within apocalyptic literature, particularly Qumran, to talk about those who will inherit the age to come, or the age of light, this age being darkness. And then talking about when the unrighteous wealth or mammon fails, which is associated with this age, and the failing being the day of judgment going into the age to come, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. And so eternal dwellings being associated with the age to come. And so this is how they would have understood the allegory within the parable, is the apocalyptic redemptive framework that was commonly held. So in verse 2, where the unrighteous manager is told to turn in an account of your management, that would have been associated with the day of the Lord, the day of judgment. And so it's how do you respond to the coming judgment in this age? So Jesus is talking to his disciples, but he's criticizing primarily the religious leaders, because that's who responds after the parable, and says that they're actually lovers of this age and lovers of money more than lovers of God, people, and the age to come. And so they're not responding in this age in light of the coming account that they have to give. They're not responding well, and that people in the world are wiser. People who don't know about the coming judgment, sons of darkness, are actually wiser than the sons of light, those who should know and should respond rightly. So it's a pretty intense kind of polemical parable that invites the ridicule of the religious leaders immediately afterwards. In verse 14, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all of these things, and they ridiculed him, to which Jesus responds, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts, for what's exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God." So Jesus tells the parable to kind of pick a fight, which he succeeds in doing.
Oh, yeah. He does that pretty well. That's good. Well, let's dive into some of the details, the specific details of the parable, guys. Like, I know you mentioned, John, there's allegory in this parable. And we've talked about allegory in the parables in the past here on our season. And I think it's important we talk about it again today, specifically related to this parable.
Yeah, definitely. Just before jumping into the details, because, people tend to get lost in the details. This can be an odd one to plug in all the details that can make this parable very odd.
Right.
We know Mr. Tom Wright is a big fan of seeing salvation history everywhere. Yep. Jesus Walked is to this city is somehow about salvation history and God moving on from the Jewish people.
And by salvation history, that in the academy, salvation history means realized eschatology. For those who aren't familiar.
So it's basically the idea that Jesus is always essentially framing history around everything culminating right now, and everything that the prophets foretold is happening spiritually. That's what he means.
Yep.
But mining the details or mining the parables for small little details is not how the Jewish world worked at the time. The details weren't the thing. The details communicated a general sense that people were familiar with, but the punchline is always the point of the parable. So as quickly as we can, we want to get to the punchline, and that's what we're going to get to when we start talking about the details. Two common suggestions. I'll mention this that, in our opinion, totally miss the point. Again, you're putting too much in the details, in my opinion. Is the scenario? The question is, how is the scenario called righteous by the rich man? And so one suggestion is that it was interest, which is a violation of the Torah. So it's righteous because he was the shrewd manager was eliminating the interest payment for all of them, and thus he was just keeping the Torah. That has nothing to do with the context of what's going on.
Right.
Number two, the idea is that it was the extra fee that the unrighteous manager would charge on top of the debt payment, which is how people were paid often. Think of Zacchaeus and how he had basically, taken too much money and he regretted it and he repented. But that's also not the point. Both of these miss the point. The point is the conclusion, as John was just highlighting, not all of the details. The general sense would have been understood by everyone, but the conclusion, the punchline, the thing that kind of gave everybody, that gave all the religious leaders that heard that John just mentioned, that punch in the gut, was the punchline. They'd have been like, Jesus, sounds good. Oh, you had us till the end. Then in the end, that's where it hurt. So don't mind everything for too many allegorical details. It's pretty meaningless, especially in a parable like this. You'll just get lost because that's not the intention.
Right.
Yeah, and the punchline is that you use your money and resources to help people and make friends for the age to come after the judgment.
I want people to listen to the whole podcast, John. I was going to save that for the end.
Are you going to give it? You got to give the punchline, man.
Well, I was going to give it later.
Yeah, guys. Yeah, for sure. I think, as we'll develop this punchline a little bit more, well, a lot more as we go through today's episode. But one of the important details is something you actually mentioned, John, in the apocalyptic context of the parable, and it's verse 8. And this word here, the word that gets used in verse 8, is really interesting. Verse 8, his master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. And that word shrewd, other translations would use the word astute, as you mentioned, like the CSB uses the word astute. The King James actually uses the word wise, which I think is a more helpful, commonly understood word, even still today, rather than all the way back from 1611. It's carried on. Its meaning today. And, it's interesting because the word shrewd tends to, at least in my own mind, I don't know why or how, but I suppose the word has had some negative connotations.
I don't usually think of my son, oh yeah, he's really shrewd.
Right.
That's a good boy. He's a shrewd boy. That's not usually what I think.
Right, exactly.
Like that little stinker.
That little stinker, exactly. Right, so other translations, in terms of astute, that's a helpful word the CSB uses, or even the King James is wise, I think is helpful to see here, because the connotation in verse 8 is not a negative connotation.
Yeah, so it's the same Greek word in Matthew 7, where the wise man builds his house on the rock instead of the fool on the sand. And so the idea is that, the manager understands the coming judgment and he's acting wisely in light of it. And so I agree, shrewd isn't that helpful. And then whenever this parable is taken out of its apocalyptic context and you have the word shrewd, then it just opens the door to you can be hard-headed, rude, self-interest, which is kind of how we associate with that word for God somehow, and God thinks it's good. I've heard this parable get used in Christian business context, and it's just like, what are you talking about?
Right.
Not cool.
Not cool. Totally, man.
Yeah. Another element of the parable that, again, I think would have probably been understood is the rich man, just like actually all of the parables, the rich man in the parable isn't the good guy.
Exactly.
So the rich man isn't an example of ethics in the story. So the big question, why does he commend the shrewd manager for acting that way? Well, verse 8, Jesus says it. They're two sons of this age acting shrewdly in order to achieve a common carnal objective. And so he's taking an example that people recognize as not good, and he's saying, so basically the rich man, it is assumed, shares the same value as the manager. So when the rich man approaches him and goes, "Well done, buddy. We know how to get what we want." And Jesus is saying, so they're shrewd in terms of the value system of this age, but the sons of light don't know how to secure for themselves eternal dwellings using money. And so he's basically going to make the parable that it's about being commended by God for having used wealth in this age to secure eternal dwellings with the value system of God. And so in the parable, both the rich man and the manager are two, quote unquote, in verse 8, sons of this age. These are two guys who share the same value system, and that's why he's commending him. And so he's going to flip the script and talk about the sons of light. They ought to be preoccupied with securing eternal dwellings with money instead of securing, a better retirement when you're 65. So I think that's kind of the punchline of the parable.
And the unrighteous steward in this parable is the exemplar or hero of the story, similar to the unrighteous judge in a couple chapters in Luke 18. And so nobody is saying that, the allegory is perfect. Again, right. Like you're saying, Bill, it's the punchline that he acted more in line with the reality of the future
right.
that he was facing than the religious leaders were, in their own day in light of the future that they're facing. And so, so this plays out in verses 10 through 13, where the future that is being faced is the true riches, and the true riches, which everybody would have understood. If you can't be trusted with the unrighteous mammon of this age, then how can you be trusted with the true riches of the age to come, meaning the new earth, the resurrection, the dead, etc. And so the conclusion of the parable includes the same saying that's used in Matthew 6 about not serving two masters and storing up true riches with God that will be repaid at the day of the Lord and in the resurrection, the age to come.
Yeah, John, really, really helpful. Well, I think like we always do in looking at these parables, we go back to Second Temple literature and the Tanakh and see if there's any background that we can find there that informs our understanding of this parable. So let's do that, guys. Anything you can think of, anything that we should highlight from Second Temple literature?
Well, to begin in the Tanakh, I mean, so the rabbis count 613 commandments. And of the commandments that aren't related to the temple and the sacrificial system and the priesthood, the number of commandments that actually have to do with managing your possessions in a way that honors God is pretty significant. Once you narrow it down. So this definitely becomes a priority in discussing how to manage possessions, especially in context to the Torah, since especially in Deuteronomy, he emphasizes you're about to go into a land with all of these houses and vineyards that y'all didn't build and you didn't plant, and you must steward them in a way that honors me, because I'm giving them to you and I'm letting you live in my territory. So you must behave with these things in a way that honors me. And then the development that happens in Second Temple literature is essentially what's projected forward is the way that God feels about how we manage our possessions actually has a lot to say about our eternal dwelling and our eternal standing with God on the last day. And so it becomes a priority in several texts to talk about those that steward wealth in this or that way, and it will change the way they experience the day of judgment. So like here's a few just in passing. A couple from Ben Sira, the wisdom of Ben Sira, 5:8. Do not depend on dishonest wealth, for it will not benefit you on the day of calamity. So again, the way you deal with money right now with integrity changes how you experience the future. Ben Sira 29:10 and 11. Lose your silver for the sake of a brother or a friend, and do not let it rust under a stone or be lost. Lay up your treasure according to the commandments of the Most High, and it will profit you more than gold. So again, dealing with things honorably so that it benefits you in the future. Now, Second Baruch, being a much more apocalyptic text than Ben Sira, actually kind of projects this forward even more. So in 2 Baruch 44, this is like verse 9, says, For that which is now is nothing, but that which is in the future will be very great. For everything will pass away which is corruptible, and everything that dies will go away, and all the present time will be forgotten. There will be no remembrance of the present time, which is polluted by evils. For he who runs now runs in vain, and he who is happy will fall quickly and be humiliated. Then he's going to have a contrast here. For that which will be in the future, that is what one will look like. And that which comes later, that is what we shall hope for. For there is a time that does not pass away. And that period is coming. So you see a lot of the language there. So those who are storing up and running now, it's all passing away. But in the future, it's not going to pass away. So, and that period is coming, which will remain forever. And there is the new world, which does not carry back to corruption those who enter into its beginning. For those are the ones who will inherit the time of which it is spoken, and to these is the heritage of the promised time. These are they who prepared for themselves treasures of wisdom, and stores of insight are found with them, and they have not withdrawn from mercy, and they have preserved the truth of the law. For the coming world will be given to these, but the habitation of the many others will be in the fire. So you see, from the start, he's going to contrast two ages, right? The present time with its corruption and the future time, which does not pass away. And some men who have stored up for themselves treasures of wisdom and who have not withdrawn from showing mercy to others, they have an inheritance in that which comes in the future. And so this framework engulfs Second Temple Judaism. The framework of talking about how you steward your life generally, and then in some texts, it's really particular how you steward possessions in light of the eschaton, in light of what the prophets have said, because ultimately this is the measure of your faith. If you believe what the prophets have said, then you live out even the details of your life and how you spend your money in a way that's honoring to God, because you know that you'll have a rich reward. And that becomes kind of a standard of how we look at faith through the Second Temple period.
Yeah, and I think another aspect that deserves some attention is the use of unrighteous mammon, which, is similar in Matthew 6. You cannot serve both God and mammon. And in Jewish tradition, of course, money is not inherently evil. I think of like Deuteronomy 8, remember the Lord your God, for it's he who gives you whatever power to make wealth. And so, but whenever in the scriptures, whenever you have bribes or fraud or oppression or usury, this ends up, the money's tainted or dirty. And I think as kind of the apocalyptic hermeneutic sets in, you get a stark dichotomy of the two ages, and everything is either light or dark, so to say, and money becomes kind of associated with this age in totality, which is why I think, Jesus always uses the term mammon in kind of a derogatory sense, that it's inherently evil or dangerous. And of course, Paul associates the same way in 1 Timothy, that it's the root of many evils. And so it's kind of a fountainhead of wickedness in this age. And First Enoch 63, you get kind of a bit that sounds a lot like 1 Peter 5, where it says, "In those days the governors and the kings who possess the land shall plead that he will give them a little breathing spell from the angels of his punishment to whom they've been delivered, so that they should fall and worship before the Lord of the spirits and confess their sins before him." He goes on to verse 10, "Furthermore, at that time they shall say, our souls are satiated with exploitation money, which could not save us from being cast into the oppressive Sheol." And so the exploitation money is kind of, it's dirty and represents this age. And so I think that plays into kind of the context of the parable, where the prodigal son, he used his unrighteous mammon that he got, that was tainted, that he received by unrighteous means, and he used it, he squandered it on himself and the pleasures of this age, and didn't make friends for eternal dwellings. And it plays into the following with the rich man and Lazarus, who the rich man also did not use his wealth to make friends, particularly Lazarus, as he saw him, near his house every day. So he could have alleviated Lazarus's pain and actually been wise, but instead he was not wise and didn't take seriously the reality of the coming judgment and such. And so I think, the unrighteous mammon plays into the intensity of the apocalyptic understanding of this parable, that we have to take seriously and use it very directly for righteous ends and eternal reward.
Yeah, amen. Amen. Well, guys, let's, like we always do, talk about some of the modern approaches to this parable, because as we've seen with many of the other parables of Jesus, that the typical approach often is not within a first century apocalyptic framework, and is often completely outside of that. And I think that's often, as we've seen this parable is extremely apocalyptic, that is sadly the case, that there's a lot of modern scholarship that still kind of holds the realized eschatology party line and continues that theme.
Yeah, so for example, N.T. Wright and Jesus and the Victory of God, which of course is Tom's, it's his main and most substantial work on the ministry of Jesus in particular. So he says the steward in Luke 16 and the wicked tenants in Mark 12 will be ejected from their position of trust. In each case, there's a strong probability that Jesus intended a reference to the present Jewish nation and its current leaders. The same fate will befall the unprofitable servant in the present story. The subplot in Luke's version fits very well with the subplots of certain other parables, notably that of the prodigal son. Those who do not want the king to reign over them are like the older brother who refuses to join the party. And the party, of course, is realized eschatology. Just as the king came from Rome to execute vengeance on those who rejected his rule, so the Son of Man will come, using the Roman armies to crush rebel Jerusalem. This elaboration of the basic plot coheres completely with the warning tradition in the Gospels. So in this scenario, then 70 AD is, the kind of conclusion of the sealing stamp of realized eschatology, and that's the warning of the giving of an account. And so the unrighteous, or the sons of this age are the religious leaders who aren't recognizing the coming judgment, which is 70 AD.
Yeah, that is pretty terrible.
Terrible.
Again, this is a good example of what I was talking about at the beginning, when looking at parables in a way that's completely anachronistic to how parables were understood at the time. So right, generally, if you're familiar with right, especially Jesus and the Victory of God, you find that right generally sees everything, especially the parables, as basically subtle retellings of redemptive history that are just hinting to all of his Jewish audience that they're about to get cast out, and that God's making a new people, and that God's inaugurating the eschatology, and that AD 70 is about to happen. This is how he sees all the parables. This is what Jesus is communicating. And I mean, if you didn't get it from this quote, then you're just not going to get it. I mean, talk about trying to press a square peg into a round hole. That is painful. Right. Painful right. to read that. Again, like we mentioned a couple weeks ago, it's not like we're talking about a little 100-page book, and he just doesn't have the time or the space to communicate and elaborate on why he thinks these things are speaking about this. He just says it. He just says there's no reason why the son means that, and why the manager means that, and why the steward means that. It's just because obviously this is all Jesus has in mind, is communicating how the exile is over. And so this is really problematic. And so I think what we can do is we can use just context. A way to get away from this is we use the context of the passage, and we use the context of history, and we see what is actually being talked about at the time. And I think it's a lot more clear than what Mr. Wright is leading us to believe here again.
Right, and this is why Tom gets accused of not believing in a literal second coming and such, because whenever he comments on the coming of the Son of Man, he's always associating it with 70 AD. Yep. And so his radical preterism, because he says it so much, it kind of overrules. He doesn't, I guess. Actually, I don't know. I'm not going to say he does believe in a literal second coming or doesn't. It's just that whenever he talks about passages that are seem so plainly to talk about the traditional Jewish apocalyptic coming of the day of God and coming of the Messiah, he associates that with realized eschatology in 70 AD.
He believes it. Yeah. It's just that Jesus never actually taught it. That's the problem.
Because he's always talking about 70 AD.
Right. Exactly.
Which then, kind of transforms Jesus into this subversive, esoteric, Gnostic, like, I know what's coming, and I know how redemptive history is going to unfold and flip the narrative on you guys and change everything. Like, I know God is scheming 70 AD and is reevaluating the covenant and everything, but you guys don't really know, so I'm telling you all of these parables to try to kind of communicate it, but not really. I mean, it's just the strangest approach to...
Jesus is super sneaky.
Right, super sneaky Jesus.
Well, praise God that Jesus is not super sneaky when it comes to seeing these parables through the lens of a first century Jew and apocalyptic thought. And listeners, so we hope this has been a helpful and encouraging episode in how to view this parable. We want to continue with the parables next time, and we want to take a look at the parable of the persistent widow from Luke 18. So join us again next time, and thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. God bless, and Maranatha.
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 Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.